My name is John Salvino. I'm chairman of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business Alumni Finance Roundtable. On behalf of former board chair Vern Broders and the board, we are glad you're here with us tonight. Guests in the audience include Jackie Wintern, as well as former Aliber student Bob Danko, CFO of Jan Studio. Also with me tonight is Melanie Scarlata, Director of Corporate Relations at Chicago Booth. Melanie has been with Chicago Booth since 2004, and I wanted Melanie to share a few thoughts with us. Melanie?
Thank you, John. Stand over here. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for allowing me to come up and give a little bit of a spiel up here. As John said, I'm Director of Corporate Relations, and my job is to work with companies to find mutually beneficial ways to engage you. And a lot of ways to do that, and I'd love to just give you a couple that are really easy. And I'm here. I'm going to leave some cards over here, but I'd love to talk to anybody that's interested in exploring more later. So first and foremost, we would love for you to look at the talent that comes out of those amazing students from our freshly minted MBAs to our more experienced alums. Great talent, and we have a lot of ways for you to connect with that talent. Second way is a great we really tap into it and bring that great way of thinking into your organizations is to identify some really high potential candidates within your companies that could benefit from MBA. We're happy to connect you with admissions or connect your candidates with admissions and get them nice and credential. How many Booth alums are in the audience? A good bunch of you. For those that aren't aware, there are multiple ways to get an MBA approved full-time program, and there's 3 ways to do it while you're still working. So great ways to tap into that way. And then the third really big way of engaging that group is through our executive MBA, our executive and education programs. These are non-degree programs. Come as individuals, send individuals from your organization, or we can do really personalized, customized programs that bring that thinking to your companies. So those are the 3 big ways. There's obviously multiple other opportunities, such as great events like this, podcasts, blogs, all sorts of ways to engage with our amazing faculty. And I will leave some cards up here. If anybody wants to talk about the event, I'm here and available here and support your efforts, your companies.
Thanks, Melanie. It is an honor to welcome you to Professor Bob Aliber. Professor Aliber is joining us for the 3rd time at the roundtable. Professor Aliber is Emeritus of International Economics and Finance at Chicago Booth and joined the faculty in 1965. Among his many accomplishments, he was co-editor with former Secretary of State George P. Shultz of Guidelines and Formal Controls in the Marketplace. Professor Aliber's research focus is the identification of the source of shocks that have led to more than 40 banking crises, which have largely overlapped with currency crises. The 8th edition of Manias, Panics, and Crashes, A History of Financial Crises, a book co-authored by Professor Aliber, is available for sale right outside of the classroom here. Please help me welcome Professor Bob Aliber.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be back in this classroom. For the last 20 or so years, I was in the classroom. I'd perform a little experiment at the beginning of every class. And let's perform that experiment now. So I'm distributing a blue book, traditional exam book. Now, I mostly taught 2nd-year MBAs. And I would say, identify the course that you had the previous year, the previous X that you got the most out of. And give them 30 seconds. And then I would say, and now that you've identified that course, write down the key ideas in the course and give them a minute or so. And then I'd call on someone, Vern, how many ideas did you write down?
2.
2. Vern, what was tuition in the course?
About $5,000.
5 grand. So I'd go to the board, write down 5,000 over 2, $2,500 an idea. Vern, how many weeks in the course?
16.
16. And how many hours you study a week?
About 5.
5 times 16 equals 80 over 2, 40 hours an idea. Well, this little experiment has come back to haunt me. And so I'm going to deliver 2 ideas this evening. And then when we meet here a year from now, you'll get a real blue book, and I'll ask you to write down those 2 key ideas. So the first key idea that I'm going to introduce is that the system of flexible exchange rates that we have now relied on in international markets for the last 50 years has not lived up to its promises, and it has been extremely costly. And I will this evening demonstrate, show you the relationship between cross-border investment flows and banking crises. We'll walk through a couple of different banking crises. The second key idea is that the system of floating exchange rates has been extremely costly to the United States. Now, as many of you know, the United States does not intervene in the currency markets. Every other country, virtually every other country, manages its currency by buying and selling dollars. Would we allow foreign countries to set our tax rates, our immigration policies, our rates of depreciation? We certainly wouldn't. It clearly is not in the US national interest to allow various foreigners to determine the price of the US dollar. So those are the two key ideas. Now, the reason we're here this evening is to introduce the 8th edition of Manias, Panics, and Crashes. And let me speak very briefly about the book. I inherited the book from Charlie Kinderberger, a professor at MIT. Charlie brought out the first 4 editions. I brought out the 5th edition in the year about 2000, the 6th edition in about 2006, and the 7th edition in 2015. I've passed the book on, the authorship on to Bob McCauley, formerly with the Bank for International Settlements, and he brought out the 8th edition. And the reason for passing the book on, there were 2 reasons. One is that Bob will be able to bring out the 9th edition and the 10th, and I wasn't sure I could fulfill that contract. But the second is, many readers think that there's nothing really very different between the 8th edition of the 7th and the 4th, and really those editions are really very, very different. So some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about this evening are in the 7th edition and in the 8th edition, and they will be in the book that I am now sort of working on. So when Charlie Kinderberger inherited the key idea from Minsky, and that was credit cycles can be destructive because initially they lead to a period of optimism. Credit becomes more rapidly available, and then something happens and there is a crash. Charlie Kinderberger essentially internationalized that idea by sort of demonstrating the relationship between banking crises in different countries. And my extension is in the 5th edition, the 6th, and the 7th is to show how these crashes that we've had, and we've had 60 or 70 banking crises since 1980, are related to cross-country currency movements. So I'm going to talk and introduce a couple of sort of anecdotes. In 2004, August of 2004, I got an announcement from my credit card company. You have been pre-approved for a balance transfer at 0 interest rate for a year. I called MBNA, the credit card company, to be sure I had read it correctly. They said I had, and then I said, what's my credit line? And there was a long pause, and they said, $100,000. So I said, please wire $100,000 to account 563856 at LaSalle National Bank in Chicago. Someone was willing to make me an unsecured loan at 0 interest rates for a year, unsecured. Has anyone in this room ever had a similar experience? Well, you don't have my credit line. It's quite, quite clear. But I knew we were going to have a crisis then, because MBNA essentially was borrowing the money from somebody that it was lending to me. And that somebody was not going to continue to lend to MBNA at a 0 interest rate or a negative interest rate. Who was that somebody?
All of us.
Alan Greenspan, right? Chair of the Federal Reserve. The second incident I want to talk about begins in a classroom in Hyde Park in February of 1997. A student brought a newspaper headline into class about a property price transaction in Hong Kong. The most expensive house on Victoria Peak had been sold by the owner of a Tokyo department store to the owner of a Hong Kong department store. I was just fascinated by the story. So I got on the plane in between terms in March of 1997, went to Hong Kong and then on to KL and to Bangkok. And I'd asked a former student, a banker in Hong Kong, set up a meeting with real estate people. My first meeting, he called the American Chamber of Commerce, 4 people in the room. And the first question was, what's the rental rate of return? Answer, 3%. What's the cost of money? Answer, 7%. How can you make money if you earn 3 and pay 7? Answer, the price of real estate always rises. And I knew Hong Kong was going to have a crisis. And I went on, as I indicated, to Kuala Lumpur and to Bangkok and found the same sort of phenomenon. And vividly remember sitting in the Red Carpet Club in Narita, sending emails back, massive asset price bubble in this part of the world, and it's going to implode. And here's what's going to, what will be the impacts. Now, the third personal anecdote begins in London in April of 2006. I called my friend Dimson, Elroy Dimson, a professor at the London Business School, and said, take me to lunch. And he said, I'll take you to lunch if you come to class and tell us what you're doing. There were 2 other visitors in the class that day. One was a young man from Reykjavik who had graduated from London Business School the year before. He was back in Reykjavik working as a banker for Guttner Bank. And I had this bizarre experience. I could complete all of his sentences, even though I knew nothing about Iceland. And as I left the classroom that day, I said, visit Iceland the first possible occasion. And in June of 2007, I went to Iceland and spoke with 10 or 15 economists in the central bank and the private banks and the university, walked through the stores, counted the cranes, and it was clear that there was a massive asset price bubble. A few days later, I got a call from one of the professors I had met, and he said, Bob, write us a paper on your views. He sensed that I thought that there was a massive asset price bubble. And I wrote the paper and then visited Reykjavik for the second time in May of 2008. And my first meeting was with the Prime Minister. It's not as impressive as it sounds. It's actually sort of a small country. But I had the delicate task of telling him, Mr. Prime Minister, the shit is about to hit the fan. And here's what you should be doing in anticipation of the crisis that is going to impact the country. And the advice was get the price of the currency down as rapidly as you can and separate the commercial banks from the investment banks. So you want to keep the commercial banks as viable as possible. The investment banks were essentially doomed. What I did not realize at the time, this is now 2008, was that there was a direct linkage between what I was observing in Iceland and when I was able to borrow $100,000 at zero interest rates. They were really part of the same sort of global phenomenon. So what I now want to do is to take you through what actually happened in Iceland. We'll go briefly to what happened in Japan, and then what happened in the United States. Where did the 2008 crisis in the United States come from? So the banks in Iceland had been nationalized in the 19th century, and they were privatized beginning in the year 2000. And they became quite aggressive, and they sold their IOUs denominated in the US dollar, the Swiss franc, the Japanese yen in London, and they brought much of the money home to Reykjavik and lent the money to Icelandic firms and households. These firms and households then converted the dollars, the yen and the Swiss francs into the Icelandic krona, which tended to push up the price of the Icelandic krona. Now we're going to go through balance of payments accounting. And some of you will remember that if a country has a capital account surplus, it must have a current account deficit, because this famous definitional equation, C plus K equals 0. A country's balance on its current capital account and a country's balance on its current account must be equal and offsetting. So essentially what happened in Iceland was that Iceland developed a massive asset price bubble in stocks in order to induce households and business firms to increase their spending. Iceland had a massive consumption boom, and this consumption boom was designed to increase Icelandic spending on foreign goods in an amount that approximated foreign purchases of Icelandic securities. Right, so let's just go over that once again. There's a money inflow into Iceland. The money inflow tends to push up the price of the Icelandic krona, but Icelandic spending on foreign goods must be equal to foreign purchases of Icelandic securities. So the price of Icelandic securities had to rise by an amount that would lead to an increase in Icelandic spending on foreign goods. And then Lehman, September 15th, occurred. The international credit markets froze. The Icelandic banks were not able to refinance their maturing IOUs, which meant that the borrowers from the Icelandic banks were required to repay, and the system collapsed. All right, we comfortable? Any questions on Iceland before we come now to, please,
So I feel like the government led,
just a little louder.
oh, I'm sorry, the government let the banks fail. They didn't bail them out, correct?
I'm sorry, is that a question?
Yes. Because I think they did, right? They saw that it was an issue and let them fail instead of taking tax dollars to apply to the losses of the government banks.
Well, the government was obliged to bail the banks out. But the government had no understanding of the economic process that led Iceland to be a extraordinarily precarious position, right? And the insight I want you to take away and to share is that adjustments in Iceland were necessary in response to the money inflows to ensure that Iceland's foreign payments were equal to its receipts. Please,
And why do they
a
have,
little louder,
yeah,
please.
why do they have to do that? So they sold assets to somebody else. And then they bought stuff that would perish, presumably, not everything durable they're getting. So they're gonna get killed. I mean, their net worth is gonna go down. Why, who came up with this? Why do they have to spend this stuff out?
Well, if you think of double entry bookkeeping, payments must equal receipts. So Iceland's payments to foreigners has to be equal to foreigners' payments to Iceland. Then we have the shock, an increase in the foreign demand for Icelandic securities. Something has to occur to ensure that Icelandic payments to foreigners increase. Let me take you through the next episode, which is Japan in the second half of the 1980s. You will remember that Japan had a massive economic boom that began in 1960, when it began in 1950, when it started to rebuild after the Second World War, and the boom continued until 1990. Japan had a massive asset price increase in the second half of the 1980s. Real estate prices surged. The quip was that the Japanese gangsters, I think the term is yakuza, the counterpart of the mafia, found it more profitable to borrow from the banks than to steal from them. So asset prices went up extraordinarily high. Now, the conventional explanation for the surge in asset prices in Japan is the money supply increased. Well, in Chicago, we know money supply increases, goods prices increase. But that's not what happened in Japan. Money supply increased and asset prices increased. The goods prices did not increase. And so the adjustment in Japan was, in the first half of the 1980s, there had been a tremendous outflow of money from Japan, and its capital account deficit was 5% of its GDP. And you'll remember that in in 1985, the so-called Plaza Accord was an agreement involving the management of currencies. In the second half of the 1980s, the price of the Japanese yen increased as its capital account deficit declined. And when we're back to the same identity in Japan that we dealt with in Iceland. If Japan's capital account deficit declines, there must be a counterpart decline in its current account surplus. And what Japan needed at the time was a very sharp increase in consumption spending that would lead to an increase in Japanese spending on foreign goods equal to the increase in foreign spending on Japanese securities. So the model that fits Iceland also fits Japan. Now, the peculiar phenomena is that Japan's imports are skewed to raw materials and petroleum, and the Japanese do not like to buy foreign branded goods other than some high quality French handbags. And so Japan needed a massive increase in its capital account and its asset prices to induce an increase in spending on foreign goods that was a counterpart of the increase in foreign purchases of Japanese securities. Now let me come to the third issue that I want to deal with, and that's what happened in the United States. Where did the 2008 crises come from? Well, earlier I had mentioned that in 2004, I was able to borrow $100,000 zero interest rates. So we had a massive increase in asset prices. We had a sort of spike in asset prices, but what was the source of the spike? Two things were happening. The primary thing that was happening was that China had been introduced into the global economy, and China's exports began to surge in the year 2000, 2001, and China developed a very large trade surplus because it managed the price of the currency. If China had a trade surplus, that meant it had a capital account deficit. It was buying foreign securities. It was buying US dollar securities. At the same time, the Chinese demand for petroleum was increasing. And you remember that the price of petroleum went from $15 to $140 in about 12 years. The petroleum producing countries had a large trade surplus. They were buying dollar securities. So the US capital account surplus increases. But as we know, if a country experiences an increase in its capital account surplus, it will at the same time have a counterpart increase in its current account deficit. And so US asset prices rose very sharply. We had a spike in asset prices from 2004 to 2006. When the foreign demand for US dollar securities stopped coming in, asset prices stopped increasing. And when asset prices stopped increasing, those investors who bought real estate because the price was always increasing, essentially found that they could not refinance their securities. So the theme I want to introduce you to is that we have lots of money flowing across national borders. When the money comes into a country, it leads to an increase in asset prices and to a capital account surplus, but there must be adjustments to ensure that the country's payments to foreigners increases rapidly as its receipts from foreigners from the sale of securities. And that's the underlying problem with the flexible exchange rate system. It encourages asset price bubbles, and for a while the bubbles become self-propagating, but then investors realize that there's a massive discrepancy between asset prices and goods prices. The money stops coming in and the crash occurs. The problem is inherent in the flexible exchange rate system. So that's the first key idea, right? The floating exchange rate system is inherently unstable. The second key idea looks at the floating exchange rate system from the point of view of the United States. Let me mention several of the factual observations. The United States has had 4 asset price bubbles since 1980. In the 1980s decade, stock prices rose by a factor of 4. In the 1990s decade, from the last 3 years of that decade, US stock prices doubled. That is described as the dot-com boom. But what was essentially happening during that period was that the Asian countries, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, had devalued their currencies. They went from having trade deficits to having trade surpluses. Their trade surpluses led to an increase in the flow of funds to the United States. The US capital account surplus increased, and so the United States needed a counterpart increase in its current account deficit, and we had a spending boom. I've already mentioned the third asset price shock that occurred in the housing market between 2002 and 2006. US house prices doubled. We've never had that experience in the previous 200 years in the United States. And then in the 2015, 2017, there was another surge in foreign purchases of US dollar securities that led to an increase in the price of the US dollar. So the idea I want you to take away is money flowing into the United States leads to increases in asset prices. If less money comes into the United States, US asset prices tend to decline. Now let's look at some of the other impacts. In 1980, the United States was the world's largest creditor country. We are now the world's largest debtor country. And net foreign claims on the United States are equal, about as large as US GDP. Our trade deficit is now 4% of our GDP. Because of the trade deficit, we've lost, and this is a ballpark estimate, 3 million jobs in manufacturing. The idea that the United States is not a competitive producer of exports of goods is nonsense. We're the second world's largest exporter. China is the world's largest exporter. But our trading partners have underpriced their currencies, which is why we have developed a trade deficit, and we have the successive governments in Washington, until that of President Trump, essentially accepted the changes in the price of the dollar that resulted from foreign intervention in the markets without any questioning of the domestic costs. Because the price of the dollar has been artificially high due to foreign intervention, the profit rate in the production of tradable goods has been diminished, and our growth rate is lower because we've had a smaller incentive to invest in the production of tradable goods. because we've had a large trade deficit, we've had a larger fiscal deficit. The statement is often made that Americans save too little. That's nonsense. What essentially happens is that foreign savings flows into the United States, drives up asset prices, and we have consumption booms. So let me point to the two key ideas that I want you to take away. The first key idea is that the system of floating exchange rates is inherently unstable, and it leads to these boom and bust cycles in individual countries, including the United States. And the second key idea that I want you to leave you with is that the US policy of non-intervention in the currency market has been extraordinarily costly to the US national interest. You've been very patient. Let me have your questions, comments, observations. Please, sir.
So
I forgot my hearing aid, so you're going to have to speak louder.
the booms and busts that you've described in the last 50 years how are they different from the several hundred years previously when there was more global management
Sure.
currency, whether it's old or whatever?
Right. So you probably read an earlier edition of this book, which talks about the booms and busts before the movement off gold to the flexible exchange rate systems. So the booms and busts are much more severe. They've led to a consolidation of the financial system. Every time we have a bust, 30–40% of financial institutions fail, which leads to consolidation and leads to an increase in the size of the largest institution relative to other institutions. The Washington decision to allow JP Morgan to buy First Republic was inane. The Washington had made the correct decision with respect to Singapore Valley Bank, and so it said none of the top 10 banks could buy the carcass of Singapore Valley. That's what should have happened. So yes, we had booms and busts, but they've been much more severe with the floating exchange rate system, if you want a cross-time comparison, and that is that the bust that occurred in 2008 would have been much more severe if we had followed 1930s type policies. That is, it was the response to the bust that meant of the Obama administration that meant that we did not have a crisis comparable to the crisis that led to what we've called the Great Depression. Great question, thank you. Please, sir.
Professor, what would you use as an intervention mechanism that is sustainable? Even recently, Switzerland gave up its peg to the euro versus the Swiss franc. It seems that throughout history, there doesn't seem to be a sustainable method to intervene in currency markets for any central bank.
This is another great question. So if I were in charge, I have these sort of Walter Mitty moments, you know, dreams of greatness. The White House is calling, Bob, what should we do? And we share, I think, this, what I would call the Chicago bias. We want markets to operate. We want to minimize the intrusion of markets. So if I look at the US trade deficit and then say, where are the counterpart trade surpluses? They're in two groups of countries. They're in countries in Northern Europe, Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, Sweden, and then the countries in South Asia, Singapore, Taiwan, etc. Some of these countries have trade surpluses that are 8 or 10% of GDP. I would call that these countries are following beggar thy neighbor policies. They intervened in the exchange market to prevent the price of their currencies from increasing because they do not want to lose manufacturing jobs. They do not want the adjustments associated with a stronger currency. So if the White House call, I would sort of say, let's adopt tariffs on those countries that have extraordinarily, is there something I should be doing? Yeah, thank you. We'll adopt tariffs of 20% on the countries that have trade surpluses greater than 8% of GDP. We will announce that we'll be happy to take off these, reduce these tariffs as these countries undertake the adjustments so that their trade surpluses decline. We are a very competitive nation, but our success as an exporter has been blunted because foreign countries have intervened sharply to prevent increases in the price of their currencies. Our trade deficit results from the accumulation of the trade surplus policies of our trading partners. This is not a way to manage a great country.
Do you think the Chinese?
Please.
Do you think the Chinese are propping up their currency? I mean, there was a period.
No, the question is, are the Chinese propping up their currency? Forgive me, sir, you have it backwards. The Chinese have propping down the value of their currency. That's why they have a massive trade surplus. I'll be happy to sort of speak on China in the 7th edition of Manias in a moment. In the 7th edition of Manias, I introduced an epilogue on the crash in China. Why the epilogue? Well, it had not yet happened. The 7th edition was a 2015 book, but we're beginning to see the move from extraordinarily rapid growth in China from 1980 to 2020. And now China is going to grow very much like Japan in the 1990s decade after the collapse of its asset price bubble. Please, sir.
Where are we now in the boom bust cycle, in your view?
That's a great question. So the question is, where are we in the boom bust cycle? So let's just backtrack a little. When interest rates were very high, a lot of foreign money came in, and stock prices went up. Property prices went up. We had the boom in crypto, etc. And they were consequences of the increase in foreign purchases of US dollar securities. Now, even though interest rates are high, we see that the dollar is becoming weaker, and the inference has to be that foreigners are buying dollars at a far less rapid rate. So a great deal will depend on how rapidly the foreign purchase of US dollar securities, how rapidly, I want to get the tail end of that sentence correctly, how rapidly foreign purchases of US dollar securities decline. If we saw an extraordinarily rapid decline, then that will lead pressure on the prices of US securities. Please, yes.
So on
A little louder, please. Oh, great. Thank you.
multinational organizations, IMF, World Bank, right? They were designed after post-World War II to help support capitalism for all, right? If we can trade with our partners, we can build a better democratic environment. So do you see any of those organizations, multinational organizations, helping support this type of scenario with a potential worldwide bank crisis, any country bank crisis, US bank crisis?
This is an very interesting question. Let me just repeat it. Can the United States count on the support of global institutions, especially the IMF, to move toward greater currency stability? The answer is no. The IMF is a hopeless institution. It started with, let me backtrack. It's a hopeless institution with regard to trade issues among the 7 or 10 largest countries. It's great for smaller countries, but we need U.S. leadership on these issues. I find, in a curious way, though I was not a supporter of President Trump in any way, he had the right intuitive instincts with respect to the loss of U.S. manufacturing jobs because foreigners were manipulating the prices of their currencies. And he should be given, did not have a systematic understanding, but he had a gut intuition that markets were not operating. Yes. Please, sir.
Considering the contribution of energy prices to global instability, would you support, there was a concept that floated as like a petroleum buyers club as a counterweight to OPEC or any other consortium that would seek to control energy prices or any commodity price for that matter? Is that something you would support?
This is another great question. Thank you. The largest petroleum market in the world is in the United States. The largest market in the world is in the United States. And Bob's plan has been that we should put a fence around the United States, and we'll allow some of our friendly foreign countries to be inside the fence. We'll keep the price of petroleum stable between $50 and $75, and we'll turn the world's energy market if there's going to be a cartel, I want it managed by Americans, not by foreigners, right? And we'll get the rents from the cartel rather than people in these other countries. Thank you. Sir, please.
So C plus.
One moment, please.
Yeah, C. Oh. Thank you. Right. So I don't know if any of you else had the pleasure, but I was a student 1987. So C plus K or equals zeros is bringing back some memories.
Your grade is might be either increased or decreased, right?
In any case, there's so many questions, but one would be, how does your model take into account $9 trillion worth of K purchased by the Fed, not a foreigner, but it would seem that it would otherwise make the currency rise and consumption boom if in the model of someone buying a lot of securities. And then the second one is kind of related to that.
Sorry, let's just expand on the first one before we go to the second.
So you can say that that foreigners must purchase securities that equals the current account deficit, right? That's the equation. But what happens if the Fed does? What happens if the Fed is buying the securities? It seems like it would have some effects as well, especially if large.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Well, let's go back. It's double entry bookkeeping, right? If foreigners want to buy more dollar securities, adjustments must occur so that Americans supply more dollars to them. That's the way the markets operate. It's the way every market operates. Nothing is different about the currency market. All that is different is I've called one the capital account and I've called the other the goods account. And if I could just continue for a second, changes in money market flows are extraordinarily rapid relative to changes in goods market flows.
Yes. I guess the other way of asking the question is, do central bank purchases of securities have any effect at all on the various, on the consumption boom, let's say?
Sure. So, Mr. Green in 2004, Mr. Greenspan observed that the price of the dollar was increasing. The price of foreign the prices of foreign goods in the United States was declining because of the change in the exchange rate, and he could afford to be very expansive in the management of his monetary policy. So Fed policy has a difference, but I'm glad you've raised the question, because the 9th edition of this book, have I done too much of that hustling? The 9th edition will have a chapter on what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. This was not an international crisis. And so but we had a surge in the prices of US securities beginning in 2020, March or April. We're hit by the pandemic. President Trump says the airplane is going to fly over and provide money to those Americans whose incomes, taxable incomes, are less than $75,000 a year, and the Federal Reserve becomes extremely expansive. Now, there are problems in a few industries because of the pandemic: the travel industry, any industry that involves large venues, theater industry, ballparks, etc. But this is not the unemployment in these handful of industries is not the sort of unemployment which can be affected by changes in monetary policy. So we have an extraordinarily aggressive monetary policy, which leads to very rapid increases in asset prices. And we have 10 years and nothing happens. I misspoke. We have a year and nothing happens to the goods price level. And then the goods price level surges, and the Powell Fed changes its policy very rapidly. And it takes away all the goodies that it takes away most of the goodies that it provided to Americans. I have a house in Hanover, New Hampshire that I think of as my bank. That is, like, continually keep it as the mortgage as large as possible and the interest rate as low as possible. And so 15 months, maybe 16 months ago, I had a 15-year fix at 2.5%. This is essentially a negative real interest rate, right? And this is all due to Chairman Powell's aggressive monetary policy. The inflation hits and he becomes extraordinarily contractive. Silicon Valley Bank may not have managed its duration risk in a clever way, but it is a victim. It's dead, kaput, it's no longer here. It was killed essentially by the rapid change in the Fed's monetary policy.
Real quickly, for the future, let's say the BRICS or the BRICS Plus decide that they no longer want to use the dollars, the reserve currencies, for transactions. let's say they announce that tomorrow. What do you think the impact on asset prices, inflation, et cetera, would be across the world?
I'd like to pun on that one. Please, Lyric.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's been very thought-provoking for me. By the way, I'm Lyric Hale. I'm an undergrad.
Could you talk
So
into
I'm
the mic?
hardcore, you see. So my question, first of all, is about China, to share my experience with China, with American companies going to China. It wasn't just about currency. It wasn't just about labor. It was also about the regulatory environment. Just at the exact same time, the EPA was issuing 1,400 new regulations every year. And so that forced them into that position. So anyway, as a result of that, of course, we all know jobs were lost in the United States. Fast forward to today, China's youth unemployment rate is north of 20%. People here, including, for example, my brother who runs a factory, he can't get enough people to work. So the idea of bringing jobs back from China to the United States is kind of ridiculous. There's no practical reality to that. So
Is there a question?
yes. So the question, yeah. So my question is what is really the role of currencies and what's your prescription for that? Do you think Nixon made a mistake in 1972? Do you think we should have been on the gold standard? All of these global issues of globalization, which I described just a couple, how is currency the solution? Or going to Robert Mundell, is his idea of a global currency really the way to go that doesn't disadvantage small countries in the way that this system does? So,
Well, it raised at least three questions. China has been a fabulous success story. It's a marvelous statement to what I would call their New Hampshire or Vermont values. Hard work, save a lot, burden sharing. We were last in China 3 years ago, and we took the train from Hong Kong to Beijing. We got on the train at 8 in the morning and got off the train at 5 in the evening. The train made 7 stops. This is the same as the distance from Miami to Montreal, which takes 2.5 days. I mean, it's just a fantastic accomplishment. We've had the greatest migration in history. 400 million people have moved from living in hovels with dirt floors and having to bring the water in to living in what we would call middle-class standards. Just tremendous accomplishments. There are now massive imbalances in China, and the economy is going to adjust. One of those imbalances is that hit the press 3 weeks ago is that because of the one-child policy, the population is declining. That means the workforce is declining. That means the number of retired people is increasing relative to the number of workers. That means the demand for hospitals is going to be increasing. There are 50 million, let me backtrack for just a moment. In April of 2012, I spoke to our alumni in China at lunch. And a young man in the front row said he just moved into his apartment building and he was the only one living in the building. And as I was driven around Beijing in the evening, I looked at the light patterns in the buildings. Many apartment buildings were sort of dark. And on our next trip to Beijing, I told one of my former students, take me to a real estate development office. And there in the middle of the room was something called Beijing Hills, right? It was a massive real estate development. And I felt I was like a character in a Mammoth play, and he was trying to make the sell, and the sell was $600,000 US. And then what's the income of the buyer? $20,000. That's the price to income ratio of 30. Right? China now has, but apartments have have had an extraordinarily high rate of return because the prices always keeps on increasing until the pandemic. And the pandemic meant that the buyers could not meet with the sellers. And then it turned out that the sellers are running a Ponzi scheme. The sellers, the developers essentially took the cash from the sale of houses on Tuesday to complete the projects that they promised on Monday. So now China is going to have to absorb 50 million. I don't know whether the number is 40 million or 60 million. It doesn't really matter. It's a massive number relative to the stock of modern houses. Those prices are going to fall very sharply. That means household net worth is going to decline by 2/3. 50 million people, let's see, 50 million? No, 70 million people have been at work in construction. The numbers are just immense. There's no reason for a new apartment to be built for the next 10 years, right? Jobs are going to have to be found for these, but government debt is just going to soar. The banks said, I could go on like this. And Z essentially is very much a nationalist, and he's going to make the adjustments in China more difficult. I'm not going to deal with the second part of the question on global stability. Please, sir.
Are there any I have not read the book, so I don't know.
But you could buy one.
I know I can. Issues, right? I'll look for them. Are there any investment funds, hedge funds, or are there any funds that follow your macroeconomic theories that you would say have it right?
That's a great question. Does anyone here manage a hedge fund that would like to hire me as a consultant? Joe?
Sandy Stroessman.
Joe's making me an offer. That's what we're going. I think the question is a good one. So if you've heard the message is stock prices in countries can be greatly affected by money inflows, etc. When the money comes in, asset prices tend to increase. If the money comes in, but at a lesser rate, asset prices, that's one of the messages I want you to take away. And when you see your broker next, ask him what he thinks about it. And then you may decide on the basis of his answer to change brokers.
Okay.
What do you think the current
Please,
state?
hold first. Second.
What do you think the current state of the banking system is in the US with, the recent failures? Is that going to greatly expand? I mean, I've met with real estate developers recently who feel that, most of the office buildings in Chicago, if they were asked to refinance today, would be handed back to the bank, and there's going to be, probably tremendous losses in commercial office real estate in the US. But just generally, what do you think the state of the US banking system is?
Well, the US economy is going gangbusters. It's going gangbusters. Everyone who wants a job can have a job. We saw the marvelous news a couple of days ago about the Black unemployment rate. And the Black unemployment rate is as low as it's ever been. So this is the result of very strong demand. So what we have happening in the United States is we have our large trade deficit is taking a tremendous amount of dollars out of the country. And for better or worse, we have a large fiscal deficit that offsets the harmful effects of the large trade deficit. It brings back a few of those manufacturing jobs, but not many. So if you follow the logic, we're not really going to get the fiscal deficit under control to a manageable level until we get the trade deficit under control. If you want, our spending in foreign goods is enhancing fiscal revenues in other countries, at the cost of a larger fiscal deficit in the United States. How long can this go on? Well, I mean, there is the risk that the foreign demand for US dollar securities will decline, and that, as in the past, could lead to a collapse in different US markets. I can't speak to the commercial real estate market. Please.
Does the debt ceiling crisis impact foreign interest and the demand for our currency and our dollars?
I'm sorry, start again.
Does the debt ceiling crisis currently that we're dealing with impact foreign demand for our dollars?
Well, there's so strong foreign demand for our dollars, but we have a meeting someplace. The BRICS, our friends, Brazil, Russia, India, China, a meeting someplace. Any of you lend these people your credit card? No. I wouldn't lend them sort of my credit card. They're not our friends. But I would be happy if they bought fewer dollar securities, because their trade surpluses would decline and our trade deficit would decline, and that would bring more manufacturing jobs here. That's just inevitable. Those manufacturing jobs are coming back. I can't predict how rapidly they're coming back, but a 4% trade deficit is just too large to be sustainable. 2% might be sustainable. So we'll get back, we'll get a million or more increase in manufacturing jobs as a result of the decline in the trade deficit. Please, sir.
Okay.
Hold for just a second.
Since I heard this saying that the trade deficit of America and East Asia is a pillar of American hegemony. So since I'm come from Taiwan and we are a benefactor of American hegemony and American trade deficit because you're one of our largest trade partners. My question is that by pulling these manufacturing jobs back from Asia to America, that will also hurt the American partners in Asia. Do you think it is worth it, or if there is any policy options that can balance these interests? Thank you.
Well, the Taiwanese accomplishments are phenomenal. They're super phenomenal. I first went to Japan in 1960. The Japanese accomplishments in the next 40 years have been phenomena. I was a diplomat in 1964 and went to Korea, and it was as if the war had been over 2 weeks before. It was still a poor, broken country. We managed, the US government managed a change in the price of the currency, and South Korea has boomed. Just phenomenal accomplishments. But the Taiwanese trade surplus is much too large, and you should tell that to the government. And tell them that if the president ever calls Bob Aliber at 2 a.m. and asks for advice on what to do about Taiwan, sort of, yes, we'll defend them, but you got to get the value of the new Taiwanese currency up. And you need to spend more on your defense. We spend a great deal on your defense. But I want to go back to the earlier part of your question, where you use the term US hegemony. And what has happened is, so the US, we should be very proud of what Americans have accomplished with respect to the rebuilding of Europe, the reintegration of Germany, the rehabilitation of Japan, the success of South Korea. We have a lot to, the availability, the openness of the American market has been phenomenal. So if we sort of the counter experiment. The next President Trump closes off the Taiwanese market, closes off the US market, Taiwanese goods, it would kill your country. You become too dependent on the United States. Carry that message back, sir.